Nationals leader David Littleproud, good to see you. So what does proper process mean?
Well, this is about making sure approval processes through where the EPBC Act is triggered, through environmental impact statements, the same approval processes that many of the resource projects would undertake. You're talking about it. In fact, there's a project up in central Queensland that's over 100,000 acres that'll be covered by wind turbines. That's a significant environmental impact. If you're going to knock down remnant vegetation and knock away remnant habitat, then there has to be an environmental impact on that and the species that live there. So this is asked for by the governments on mining projects. Why wouldn't we do the same thing for these large industrial scale wind and solar projects, as well as what we're doing with the 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines? We are destroying the very thing we're trying to protect with renewable energy, and this is where we've got to get the balance right. This is where some common sense needs to prevail, not just in the planning, but also in the execution, and that's what the Nationals are saying. We're not against renewables, we're just saying there's a better way to do it, and this government's reckless race to 82% renewables by 2030 is having a significant impact on the environment.
How much would this slow the approval process down by, do you think?
Well, due process is due process, and that's as quick as the proponents want to undertake the appropriate studies. But it's the same as any other industrial proposal, whether it be mining or anything else. If you're going to have an impact on the environment, you need to demonstrate what that impact is, how you mitigate that, if at all. And so that's what I think anyone would expect. And I think that to give one industry a particular free ride or an easy ride through this, particularly when there are perverse environmental as well as social outcomes to this, is that we need to make sure that we've got the planning right, and we should do the right thing and undertake proper process. That's all the Nationals are asking for. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it's common sense, because we're the ones that have the lived experience of seeing what's happening out in these communities, that it's important that this is respected.
Yeah, we can often see with some of those resources and fossil fuel projects, they can be in the environmental approval processing for years. Sometimes it's up to a decade. Do you think this would happen here, or would you have a problem with that?
Well, no, so long as proper process is undertaken, but that should be the responsibility of the proponent to make sure that they've lived up to all the responsibilities. That's the thing, is we're saying that this does have a significant environmental impact when you're seeing hundreds of acres, in hundreds of thousands of acres of remnant vegetation being knocked down for renewable projects and for the transmission lines. Shouldn't we actually understand what we're knocking down and the environmental impact? I can't believe that the Green movement isn't jumping up and down. It's been left to the National Party to come forward and to put some common sense solutions. The Greens and the Green movements have washed their hands of the damage, the environmental damage that these renewable projects are having on remnant vegetation, on native species, that some of which are endangered. And you just have to wonder, where is their moral compass? Where are their moral values that they've prepared to wash their hands of what's happening at the coalface, for want of a better term, out there in regional Australia that we're seeing. We're seeing the real impacts on the environment and on our food security through prime agricultural land being ripped up. And you know, you've got the WWF giving report cards out on agriculture, yet I haven't seen them give a report card out on renewable companies and the way that they've handled knocking down remnant vegetation. You know, koalas losing their habitat. In many cases, koalas are being killed as a result of the actions of these developments.
Okay, so I'm told renewables will need approval under the EPBC process. There are 100 waiting for approval. So what are you saying essentially here is that they need to be approved to the same standard as a new coal project?
They need to be assessed for the environmental impact that they're having, particularly on remnant vegetation. Now,
but they are at
the
moment. But are you saying it's not as rigorous as it needs to be? Not to the same
scale. Not as rigorous, and particularly not even local governments are getting a say in terms of the approval processes. They're being railroaded by state governments, overridden by state governments. So it starts even as far back as the implications for local government in being able to plan for their roads and their infrastructure, to be able to support this type of infrastructure. But then it's about the environmental impacts. The rigour around that isn't as onerous as what it is for resources, but yet the same impact on knocking down remnant vegetation exists. We see it, we live with it, and we just say to those that lie at the altar of renewables, come out and have a look at what's being done to some of the remnant vegetation, the habitat that's being lost. You're looking at Yungala, pumped hydro. You're going to see platypus habitat being flooded where they won't be able to live, but a rare white eel that is rare to Australia will be lost if this is undertaken. So where is the environmental impact statements on those, on the implications of those? Instead, it's been approved and we're rushing through this.
Well, in the last week, we've heard Barnaby Joyce say net zero by 2050 is utterly untenable. So what do you say to those who bring a cynical mind to this argument that you're bringing today, that you're trying to kill off net zero by stealth and you don't really believe in it?
No, this is Labor's net zero by not 2050.
Hang on, the Nationals signed up for it, didn't they?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. There's a differentiation. Don't conflate the two. Labor's net zero is a lot different to what the Coalition's net zero was. Ours was about technology. It was about investing in technology and as well as making sure renewables had a place. But it was planned and it was planned properly, so there wasn't unintended consequences. But we also invested in technology like carbon capture storage for gas and coal. In fact, the Biden administration just announced $1.2 billion in carbon capture storage projects to make sure that we live up to our international commitments of reducing emissions by giving us reliable energy. And that's why the Nationals have led for over a decade the conversation that needs to happen around the emerging technology of nuclear, zero emission technology that can go in where existing coal-fired power stations are. We don't need 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines, which will save billions of dollars, nearly $100 billion that Australians are going to pay for. So we're just saying there was a way through this. Our net zero is a lot different to what Labor's is, and the fact that they've accelerated 2030 is putting all this pressure on electricity bills that you're paying for now. We're saying there's a better way, and in fact, Peter Dutton and I are saying there's a better way than what the Morrison-Joyce government put, because we're prepared to have the courage to add to that technology mix nuclear. And I think that's a common sense solution that I'm proud Peter Dutton and I are prepared to advance as a conversation across the country.
So do you essentially agree with Barnaby Joyce?
No, we believe in our international commitments, because if we don't, let me make this clear, if we hadn't signed up to net zero, your interest rate today, capital markets, both private and public, we're going to factor in an additional 1.5% to 3%, and so mortgage payers would be paying for that. Our farmers would be paying that on their interest bills, but they'd also be getting less for their commodities because they'd be tariffed because we hadn't made that international commitment. And so, you really want to change tack now in a cost of living crisis and go back out there and say, let's blow up net zero commitment that we've made and cost Australians a whole lot extra? We're saying we've got time. We don't need to do this by 2030. We can plan and get this properly achieved, live up to international commitments and make sure that we have a finally affordable energy that's reliable and reduces our emissions.
But we don't have time, isn't that the point? And I'm not talking about the climate aspect of all this. I'm talking about the report from AIMO, who said essentially renewables aren't catching up with the speed in which we need them, and therefore, places like Eraring coal needs to be extended. That's not an ideal situation, is it? And you're talking about nuclear, but at what point do you become pragmatic and say, well, look, we can keep on talking about nuclear and that can be your end goal to get there, but you've got to do something in the meantime?
Well, this is exactly what AIMO is saying. The government's not being pragmatic by trying to rush to 82% renewables by 2030. It can't be achieved. That's 22,000 solar panels a day must be laid. 40 wind turbines a month must be put up. There's not the supply chain for even that type of infrastructure to be sent to Australia, from China mostly, to be able to get here and be put up in time. And so what AIMO is saying is a very loud message to this government, is that their ideology isn't meeting the practical reality, and why other state governments are now having to make the right decision in making sure that we don't rush this and that we actually need to keep, like Eraring, going longer, and having to make sure that we do have that affordable, reliable power. But it's also a big message to take away all the handbrakes that have taken away investment confidence, particularly with gas. We are drawing down on gas supplies rather than firming up renewables that's required with gas. This government has demonised gas and they're not prepared to drill holes, so you're going to pay more. So that the warnings are not for AIMO to rush. They're saying, get this policy settings right. I wrote to the Prime Minister who became leader and said, let's have a National Energy Summit. Let's talk about everything that's on the table. But he turned his back on me, and unfortunately, we're paying the price for that at the moment. And the Prime Minister needs to intervene because Chris Bowen is out of his depth on this one. His ideology isn't meeting the practical reality of what's being bled out of Australians' wallets at the moment.
Yeah, we're feeling it. David Littleproud, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.